Greetings and welcome to Luca Sprues. In this video I build and review the Airfix 1/72nd scale FW-190 A-8. Construction is very easy thanks to the great quality of moulds and the easy to read instructions that are common to Airfix. Starting off with the cockpit, there were some very nice sidewall details, no raised out detail on the instrument panel, which later gets hidden unfortunately. But there are also rudder pedals and a seat, which I glued in before painting the cockpit, and two fuselage halves in a layer of German grey. Once the first layer of German grey dried, I added a second colour to the cockpit, dark grey. This is a slightly lighter colour which adds contrast and highlights the surfaces of the cockpit, creating the illusion of light and shadow and making the details pop out a little bit more. I only applied dark grey on the upper surfaces of the aircraft's cockpit. Next came the finer details. I painted the various cockpit details a mix of flat black, and later on I used red, yellow, red brown, flat earth and flat white with a steady hand and a very fine brush. Based on some reference photos, I scratch built supports for the armoured headpiece instead of using the large headrest cover from the kit. This creates more interest in detail. I used super glue and florist wire for this. I added the cockpit instrument decals and fixed them down using Tamiya Decal adhesive. While the decals dried, I scratch built some cushions for the seat out of card and painted it flat earth and a very watered down coat of tank hull red to create a leather effect. I added some seat belts by using masking tape and cutting very fine gauge copper wire and supergluing it together to make seats with seat belts inside of the cockpit. The final step for the cockpit was to use flat aluminium to paint small scratches on the seat and the exposed surfaces of the cockpit before gluing it to the other fuselage halves, along with the exhaust stacks. The fuselage halves came together very well with no gap. I prepared the wings and then put those halves together. They also fitted perfectly. While both of those parts dried, I painted the wheels, propeller and the cooling fan for the aircraft flat black. I also painted the wheel struts and engine details in flat aluminium. The wings and fuselage came together perfectly with no gaps at all. I also glued the horizontal stabilizers and rudders to the aircraft at the same time. I painted the wheel wells 2 coats of RLM grey and some of the engine parts as well in a single coat. I then assembled the engine after painting the propeller and applied heavily watered down flat black as a pin wash over the entire model. To do this, I simply diluted the flat black paint in water so it would flow into the gaps, and then later I wiped the excess away with a cotton tip. This creates some pre-shading, adding realism, and also weathers the model slightly, especially in areas where the paint will be light, such as on the underside. I wanted to do a late war scheme that I found reference photos for as a historical custom skin on War Thunder, so I designed the markings in GIMP and printed them on some custom white-backed decal paper. Because of the white markings, I had to apply the decals before painting around the excess, so I applied them as a normal decal before doing the first layers of paint. After the decals had properly set, I then painted around them, first with a layer of AK Interactive's Generation 3 RLM 76 Variation 1. This was mainly on the undersides and the side of the aircraft. I watered down the paint slightly and then applied it in the direction of the airflow with a large brush, and then with a finer brush to go around the decals. The upper side was painted to create the late war green and grey camouflage. I used olive green, again with a large brush on the wings and a finer brush to apply the paint carefully around the decals, and also to stipple some dots on the rear tail to create the modelling effect. The next layer was a coat of German grey. I carefully painted it around the cowling and applied it in a stippling motion to model on the tail as well. I painted the camo pattern by hand, by painting the outline and then quickly filling in the shape. Since it was a late war aircraft, I was okay with lots of paint getting on the decals to create the effect of markings chipping off and fading from poor production quality. I painted a second coat of RLM 76 and made sure the paint covered over the stippled grey and green areas on the tail to soften the mottling effect. I repeat the same technique several times for each layer of paint to build up a smooth paint job in the several areas, rather than applying one or two thick layers that show streaks and paint marks and also hide the panel details. Once the final layers of paint had been applied, I began to paint the markings and mismatched panel lines. The first colour I used was yellow, which was applied with a fine brush on the outer rim of the cowling based on my reference photos. I also painted a little bit onto the 12 decal and later the little dash at the tail to make them a bit brighter and not so chipped away by the paint. This was followed by gloss red on the tail to make a band marking. I applied this in 2 layers to make it smooth. I painted flat aluminium onto the unpainted panel where the exhausts are, and also on 2 side panels based on reference photos, since some German aircraft weren't painted when they left the factory late in the war. Another feature common on late war German aircraft was mismatching panel lines when they changed the RLM colours. I did this by diluting some of RLM 76 Variant 2 by AK Interactive with water and carefully painting a few of the panel and access hatches on the underside and side of the aircraft. This was to replicate the use of mismatching spare parts that was common. I'm quite a fan of this aesthetic, and the result from the mismatching panels adds some character and variety to the model. The key for this technique is to carefully follow the panel lines and recessed details, and then paint in the gaps, a bit like the same technique I used on the camouflage on the wings. I do a second coat of RLM 76 to make sure it looks smooth and finished and the variant 1 colour isn't showing through. Then I move on to patching up the decals. The aircraft had some text on the side of the cockpit based on reference photos, but it was on top of bare metal. Since I couldn't print bare metal in the printer, I had to colour the back and then carefully paint flat aluminium around the decal's words with a very fine brush. I got a small box I made as a child to place my hand on to keep a steady hand. This is a good idea to place your hand on something so that you can paint finer details more carefully without getting the shakes. After some final touch-ups such as the cannons, I then added the cockpit and painted the frame olive green before adding the common decal markings from the kit. This included the underside markings which I left off. I used the same technique of sticking the decals in water, then applying them with a paintbrush, my fingers and a knife or cotton bud. I then applied Tamiya decal adhesive over the top to get them to conform and sink into the model's surfaces. Once the markings were done, it was time to weather the aircraft. Since it was a late war German aircraft, it would have probably been poorly kept and built in a lower quality, and paint wasn't as good in the later stage, so I wanted to weather the aircraft quite heavily. This was achieved first by using a fine brush to dab stippled flat aluminium onto the aircraft to create metal chips. The key for this technique is to focus on areas that would be most likely to get chipped, such as the wing's leading edges, access hatches, the walkways, and on the landing gear legs and propeller. The reference photos I had also indicated there was a lot of chipping on the rear of the canopy, so I applied some markings to that part of the aircraft too. After the chipping was done, I added watered down flat black trailing from behind the exhaust stack and on the cannon and machine gun barrels to create gun smoke and various leaks. I also applied it to the control surfaces and flaps and dragged it back with a cotton tip to create the effects of streaking. The final detail was then to dab some watered down flat earth onto the wheels and the landing gear doors and edges of the rudder to add the effect of dirt and mud on the wheels getting flicked up, as the aircraft was probably flying out of remote strips. And with that, the model was finally completed. I really enjoyed doing this Airfix kit. It's got great details and it's very easy to build, so I would certainly recommend it to both beginners and modelling veterans. I plan to do a few more FW-190s in the future, including trying out the Revell TA-152 and Minicraft Dora version, which will be interesting to compare. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and shout out to our faithful tanker Archie for your continued support and funding this video. More videos are in the works, so stay tuned for those. Take care, and again, thanks a lot for watching, and model on!